Assalamu alaikum. There we go. Alright, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulih al-Kareem amma ba'd. So, Kareem, when we were on our way over here, he's like, so how should I do the introduction? I told him, make it really simple. And he actually went against what I told him. I said, just tell him there's some random brother from Houston that's here that's going to share some knowledge, and khalas, that's it. So, but inshallah, jazakallah khair, may Allah reward him. Tayyib, so, what was the title again? Someone help me out here. Everybody knows. I think you just said it.
The message of the Prophet Muhammad.
Okay, all right. Actually, it was originally titled The Prophet and His Message, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, by the way, if you don't know, I actually like to be very interactive. So, I was recently in Canada, and if you know about Canadians, they're very not interactive. And so, coming from the U.S., it was very odd, because I would be like, so, what do you think about this? And just pin drop silence. And it's very, strange for me, and I thought they must be thinking, what is this crazy American guy that's come here and just, being odd. But anyways, so I'm hoping you guys aren't like that, inshallah. Tayyib, let's go ahead and start. So, the title suggests, the Prophet ﷺ and his message, that I'm going to speak something about the seed of the Prophet ﷺ, when in actuality I'm not. I'm actually going to tie it to our current day and age, and exactly how does the message of the Prophet ﷺ fit with our lifestyle, where we are, what we're doing, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to actually start with the Quran itself. Now, what day is it today? Who can tell me quickly? Friday. Okay, alhamdulillah, people are paying attention. What surah? I get worried. People are like, Wednesday. It's like, what surah are we supposed to recite on Friday? Surah Al-Kahf. Right? So that's exactly where we're going to start. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and just by the way, Surah Al-Kahf, why exactly do we recite it on Friday? Does anyone know what the Prophet ﷺ told us in terms of what's the purpose? What does it do, in other words? What does it serve as? It protects you from Al-Masih ad-Dajjal, or as they know in English, the Antichrist. So this is one of the reasons why the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that we should recite it on Friday to protect us from Al-Masih ad-Dajjal, the Antichrist. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. But Surah Al-Kahf, it starts off, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ba'da a'udhu billahi min shaitanir rajim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts off, Alhamdulillahi alladhi anzala ala abdihi al-kitaba wa lam yaj'al lahu iwaja. So all praise is due to Allah, who has sent down to his servant the book, and not made therein any sort of, and the word that's used here is iwaj. So iwaj, very interesting word. Because when we say iwaj, it's like this type of deviance. Or literally, it's this type of crookedness. Like if a man is standing kind of crooked, like maybe he needs a cane or something, that's a type of iwaj. Or if you see a road in front of you and it's curved and you can't quite see the end of the road, and sometimes, if you've ever gone to those really tight spaces where they have mirrors, right? So you see that there's something you can't see on the other side. That's also called iwaj. So what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here is starting off with is that the book has been sent down and there is no iwaj, there's no crookedness. And as we're going to see, it's actually going to compare this to revelations that came before. In other words, things like what we have is the current day Bible and so on and so forth, but I'll get to that in a second. So this iwaj is literal, in other words, there's no crookedness, and it's figurative as well. Meaning in the sense that when you ponder upon it, when you think about it, it's not going to lead you somewhere astray. It's not going to be something so philosophically complex that you can't understand it. It's something that's simple, it's straight. And in the very next ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala highlights this point. قَيِّمًا لِيُنذِرَ بَأْسًا شَدِيدًا مِنْ لَدُنْ. And so it is qayyim. Who knows what the word qayyim means? For anyone studying Arabic here, by the way? Subhanallah. UT Austin, nobody, one person. Okay. Not here, but you're just studying it in general? Okay, I had a hand go up and then gone. Okay, 1, 2. Okay, you have a few people studying Arabic. Okay, alhamdulillah. So, how about this term? Qama, yaqumu. What does it mean? To stand, right? And that's why Yawm al-Qiyam is a day of standing, right? But this term, when Allah says qayyiman, it's not only something that is like something that causes something to be erect, or rather it causes something to be erect. Not only is it erect itself, meaning it's straight itself, but its cause is something, it causes the other person or the thing that it's affecting to be upright. So not only is there no iwaj, there's no crookedness in the text itself or in the revelation itself, but it's something that is straight and something that causes straightness. It causes the individual that reflects upon it to be straight, to be upright. And that permeates through every field, every single aspect of a human's life. Meaning in terms of your economic life, your social life, your psychological life, spiritual life, and so on and so forth. So, all right. But then what's very interesting, that it's qayyiman, and then Allah says, وَيُنذِرَ بَأْسًا شَدِيد. It is a warning for a ba's. Now this term ba's, who knows what it means? Arabic students. No Arabic students know what it means. Ba's, it's like, literally it means war. But it can also mean, especially when it comes to the Quran, the after effects of war. In other words, after you have warfare, what's left of the society? You may have things like orphans. You may have economic destruction. You may have family destruction. Society is destroyed. People are coming back with all sorts of psychological issues and so on and so forth. And this very term actually will tie in as we go forth. And it's very interesting because it ties into the situation that we're in today. So Allah Azza wa Jalla says it's ba's, it's shadid, it's a severe type of war or after effect of the war. Now, from Allah. The other interesting thing is that Allah Azza wa Jalla doesn't say who it's a war for. He doesn't say this is like ba's for al-kuffar. He just leaves it open. Because what happens in war? Is it only one side that goes through suffering? No, right? Obviously, whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, a person in a state of war, everyone's going to suffer, right? However, right after that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says, وَبَشِّرِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ الَّذِينَ يَعْمَلُونَ الصَّالِحَاتِ أَنَّ لَهُمْ أَجْرًا حَسَنًا. But this very text is good news for the believers who do good deeds. Okay, now that's that. Then Allah Azza wa Jal says, مَاكِثِينَ فِيهِ أَبَدًا. All right. This ajr, this jannah that the person is going to go in, the term that's used is makith. Makith is like when you're waiting for something in anticipation. Now I want you to think about this. Sometimes, when I'm talking to my kids, I'll ask them, so do you want to go to Jannah? And they'll say, well, it seems kind of boring. Like, what are we going to do there? We're there forever? It's like, what are you going to do? Because, typically when you think of something that you've had for a long time or something you experienced for a long time, eventually it gets boring, right? So let's say you get a new car. So the first day you get the new car, what are you going to do? Yo, check out my ride, man. It's got like these wheels and the engine and whatever else, it's great, and I'm getting this hooked up and so on and so forth. After 2 years or 3 years, are you still going to show it off? Someone to sit in your car and say what? Like, man, why don't you clean this joint? Right? I mean, but so in the beginning, it's like, okay, there's this anticipation. You have your car, you want to show it off and so on and so forth. Or when you're just about to get the car, right? There's this anticipation. And you can extend that to anything. That's why, for instance, when you look at movies, for instance, right? There's this idea that they always keep you hanging. In other words, there's always like a type of cliffhanger. Like they never tell you exactly what's going to happen. So I heard about this series called Lost. Has anyone seen it? Okay. So what people said is that if you actually followed the series, they always left you at the end trying to figure out what's going to happen in the next episode. And literally at the end, you're like, oh man, oh, come on. So they open up all of these loops for you to kind of be hung on to like what's going to happen next, right? And that's a technique, even with stories, even with all sorts of things. And that's why if you ever want to ruin something for somebody, just tell them what happens at the end of the movie. Because that's it. Then you want to kill the guy, right? So you want to ruin it? Tell them what happens at the end. Anyway, but the point is, you have this anticipation. Whether it's you're watching a movie, whether you're reading a story, whether you've got some sort of new object, whether you're watching a sports game, right? Whether it's football, you don't know what's going to happen. So that anticipation is always there. This term, makith, it's like this never-ending anticipation. When you're in Jannah, you're always anticipating, you're always in anticipation. You're always excited. You're always like, oh wait, I can't wait. What's going to happen next? So this term that we say, okay, it's boring, it will never be boring. And that's the term that Allah Azza wa Jalla uses. مَاكِثِينَ فِيهِ أَبَدًا. They will be like this state of anticipation forever. So it doesn't end. It just keeps on going on and on and on. That state of excitement just keeps on going on. It's a beautiful ayah. All right. Now we're actually going to get to the heart of the matter. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيُنذِرَ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ وَلَدًا. And this is a warning for those who have taken, who say that Allah Azza wa Jal has taken a son. Now who is this referring to? The Christians, right? Any difference of opinion there? No? It's referring to Christians, right? Okay. What did we say about the first ayah? We said that this book, this revelation that Allah Azza wa Jal has sent it has no iwaj, no crookedness. It is qayyiman. It's straight and it causes whatever its readers are to be straight. But that's not so for the revelations of the past. Because when there was a revelation that was sent in the past, if the revelation went wayward, if the people start to change it, what would happen? Well, the people would change it, but then Allah would send a messenger, right? And so if there's some sort of iwaj in the revelation, a messenger sent. And they try to do more iwaj, a messenger sent. But what happens with us? Are there any more messengers? La. So the final revelation has to have no iwaj. And it has to be qayyiman. It has to be straight and it has to cause people to be straight in their life. Now let's take a quick comparison. How many people are familiar with, has anyone done like Bible studies? Studied the Bible a little bit? Okay. All right. So there's a chapter in the Bible, or maybe it's called a book. It's called the chapter of Titus. And in philosophy, there's this problem that they come up with, and they call it the Epimenides paradox. And here's how it's structured. The Epimenides paradox is actually taken from this chapter in the Bible called Titus. And here's what it says. It's basically a letter that Paul wrote. Now, Paul is one of the people that actually composed parts of the Bible and is responsible for a lot of the theology of Christianity. So Paul says, he makes a statement. He says one of the highest people, and I'm just paraphrasing, one of the highest people amongst the Cretans were like a type of people, said, all Cretans are liars. So one of the Cretans said, all Cretans are liars. Is that statement true or false? Think about it. Neither. You're stuck. You can't go anywhere with that, right? If a Cretan's saying, all Cretans are liars, right? That means that statement is false. But if it's false, it means it's true. And if it means true, it means it's false. So you're gone, right? If you want to talk about iwaj, bam, right there, okay? Iwaj. So that's one aspect, that you find types like this, and this is, like I said, known as the Epimenides paradox. It's derived right from the Bible. Now, in terms of being qayyiman, causing straightness, causing something to be erect, or causing something to be straight and proper, when we look at the effects, the biblical effects that it has on, let's say, the Christian community, has it overall been something that's very, very, very positive? Overall. Maybe, right? Some things within Christianity, sure. But as we're going to see, there are certain effects that it truly doesn't cause one to be qayyiman, but rather it does the exact opposite. And we'll get into that in a little bit, inshallah. Okay, so now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then continues. He says, مَا لَهُمْ بِهِ مِنْ عِلْمٍ وَلَا لِآبَائِهِمْ. They don't have, in other words, the Christians who said that Allah has taken a son, they don't have any knowledge. All of their sophistry, all of their sophistication, because if you want to prove something like the Trinity, you have to go through a lot of philosophical hoops and ropes and jumps and all these other things, right? You have to make it seem very intellectual, but in the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just closes the door right away and says that they don't have any knowledge. They didn't have any knowledge, and their fathers don't have any knowledge. Their forefathers didn't have any knowledge. Kaburat kalimatan. That this is just this one word. And Allah doesn't say kalam. Kalam is speech, right? Kalima, it's one word. It's this one word that they say with their mouths, right? Min afwahihim. But they have no knowledge of it. And as we are going to see, Allah Azza wa Jalla calls it one word. He didn't even give it the honor of calling it speech. Because it's by this one word saying that Allah has taken a son that we will see in a few minutes how that actually caused destruction in the worst of manners. Okay, so now, and then Allah says, so they don't have any knowledge of it, nor did their fathers. And indeed, great is the word that they said, this kaburat kalimatan, it has kabura, in other words, it's great, that they speak with their mouths, but they're saying nothing but a lie. If you've ever gotten into a discussion with, let's say, a Christian, and asked them, okay, explain to me the Trinity, and watch. You're going in circles, right? It's very, very difficult it's a very difficult concept for someone to explain. Anyway, so the next ayah, and the one that we're going to focus on, Allah Azza wa Jalla says, فَلَعَلَّكَ بَاخِعٌ نَفْسَكَ عَلَىٰ آثَارِهِمْ. And so now Allah Azza wa Jalla is talking to the Prophet ﷺ, and this is where we're coming to the actual topic. That perhaps, because of this one word that they said, that perhaps you might باخع yourself. This term باخع, what it refers to is like the translation says, you might kill yourself. But that's not really what it's referring to. The term باخع is when you would like kill somebody without even touching them. Now, how would you possibly do that? In other words, a person would be so grieved or so angered or in such an emotional state that they would literally die in that state. So think of it this. Like, let's say you have someone who's very old, right? Very old person, maybe they've had like 3 heart attacks and they're just barely on the edge, and you go to them and say, "What's up, man?" And they just, oh, and just die, right? Bakhia. That's what it means. Like, you kill them, but it's just by what you said. So you've killed them. It's the effect of what you've done is bakhia. Or sometimes you may have, like you see like couples, right? You have a person, like 2 people that have been married forever, like they've been married for a long time, and then one of the spouses dies. And it's just so traumatic that eventually the other spouse, there's no real cause for their death except that they miss the other person so much. So they die, because that's how they were so depressed, they were so down. So what Allah Azza wa Jalla here is telling the Prophet ﷺ is that you have this characteristic, فَلَعَلَّكَ بَاخِعٌ نَفْسَكَ عَلَىٰ آثَارِهِمْ, that you're going to have this type of bakhia, this type of feeling upon yourself. You're going to kill yourself in this way based on their athar, on their effects. In other words, the effect of what they're going to say. Athar is literally like when you're walking and you have like footsteps behind you. And so it's the effects, it's the vestiges of what was left behind. So what's being pointed out here is that Allah Azza wa Jalla is saying that perhaps you would kill yourself, yourself, based on the effects of that kaburat kalimatan, right? That one kalima that they said. Now, here's where it gets a bit interesting. What exactly was the effect? And remember, we said that this very surah has to do with protection from what?
Antichrist.
The Antichrist, right? Al-Masih ad-Dajjal. So let's take a brief break and let's go back to Christian Europe and let's see what is the effect of this one kalima. If you've studied elements within the Dark Ages, for instance, in the Dark Ages, what was the ruling party, you could say? The church, right? Catholic Church. Okay, that was the general dominant party. And I'm using contemporary terms now in terms of party. It wasn't really a party, but basically they had rulership. Okay. Now, what was happening that time, while they were in the Dark Ages, what was going on in the Muslim world? It was, you can say, like the Golden Age, right? As a matter of fact, many of the Jewish scholars say that the Jewish Golden Age was when the Jews were under the Muslims in Spain. So you have all of these discoveries and science is flourishing and so on and so forth in the Muslim world, and in Christian Europe, they're in the Dark Ages. So they were now, when we say Dark Ages, the scientific discovery and things like that, it was nowhere to be found. And what they observed was that when they had interactions with Muslims, they found that they were on another level. Like if you traveled from, let's say, one part of Europe, like, let's say somewhere in France or somewhere in current-day Germany, and you ventured into Spain, it was like a whole new world. You're going from a place from where they have what they know as quacks. And quacks would tell you, look, you've got an issue, you got like a bodily, issue. Here's what I want you to do. The best thing for you to do, take a urine bath. This will cure it all. Of course, there's no way, right? That's completely antagonist against just rational thought. But this is what was predominant at the time. Now, let's say this person goes from that part of Europe into Muslim Spain. What do they see? They see they see these structures that have been built. They see like waterways, like a water system that's built, where how we turn on the tap, and we think that's something that maybe that's like a modern phenomenon, but actually that's rooted in Muslim Spain. So you see waterways. You see that when the structures were built, they built it in such a way that they had a lot of like lush gardens and a lot of greenery. And so it's like going from like this deep dark dungeon to like Jannah, right? That's literally what they made it like. So you find that many of the Christians that had interaction with the Muslims, right? One was they saw Muslims praying, but then they also observed the Muslims themselves in their practices. They're looking at the Muslims, and the Muslims are all encouraged, read the Quran, recite the Quran, interact with the Quran. Whereas the place that they're coming from, the Bible hasn't even been translated in the common vernacular. Like they can't read it. It's in Latin, or it's in Greek, sorry. I mean, they can't read it. So what do you do if you want to access the Bible? You have to ask the authorities. You have to ask the clergy. And they're going to tell you, this is what the Bible says. And of course we know they were all mukhlisin, yani, right? They were all sincere in how they did that. So obviously they would use that to their own advantage. So now they're looking at the Muslims. They have a direct connection with their text, awalan, and they have a direct connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When the Muslims are making dua, they're not making dua to Pope so-and-so to intercede for us. They're making dua directly to Allah. And now this has a profound impact on the European psyche, on the Christian psyche. And so many of them come and they say, look, we want to now send our children to the Muslim world to study. How did they get to this point? To get to the point to see like, okay, well, what are some of the discoveries that they're doing and so on and so forth. So many of them, at the risk of them losing their children, quote unquote, losing their children to Islam, it's a gain for us, obviously, they did it. And many of them became Muslim. Many of them didn't, however. And when they went back home, and they start to say, look, we have made these, here are some of the things that we learned. We learned, for instance, that the world isn't the center of the universe. We've learned that actually it's the sun. Now, what happened when they came with that? Were they like, oh, great, ahlan wa sahlan, right? No. They were tortured. They were put to the stake. They were beaten. And this is the treatment that they went through because of these signs. And so now, what is the paradigm that's being set up in the psyche of someone that's living at that time period? If you follow your intellect, this will now help you, and this is something that's rational, it's good, and it leads to progress. But if you follow religion, this is something that leads to downfall, destruction, and it's just something that's horrible. And this paradigm is now being set up, right? If you follow religion, if you believe in God, that's going to be bad for you. So, a time now comes, they start to now adopt, they start to now say, okay, we want to have this scientific revolution, whatever you want to call it, and the Age of Enlightenment happens. But what are the effects of the Age of Enlightenment? Number one, God, or the idea of God, is completely taken out of the picture. Because again, the paradigm is, if you have anything to do with religion, because religion for them was Christianity, okay? And so when they would come now and say, look, we want to propose this particular theory or this particular discovery, the church would knock it down, okay? I'll give you just one other example, which I thought was very interesting. When the New World was discovered, who discovered the New World? Don't say Columbus. All right. We'll put that one, we'll hold that one in abeyance, inshallah. We'll hold on to that one. So when the New World was discovered, right, by whoever, when they came back to Europe, they told them, look, we've discovered this place, the Americas, or whatever you want to call it. The church actually initially went against that. Because they say, look, we believe in the Trinity. There's three. And we believe that there's three continents. And now you're telling us there's a fourth continent? No, this knocks against our very theology. So if you're going to say there's a new world, we're going to punish you for it. Something that simple, right? A discovery. Someone actually went, discovered, saw the land, interacted with the people, comes back and says, I saw it with my own eyes. La. No way. So you find now, like I said, this paradigm is being set up. If you're rational, if you're a thinking person, if you're someone that reflects, this is something that's completely antagonist to the very idea of religion. So the church at this time, now they see the what's what's going on. They're about to lose power. So what do they start to do? They start shoving, you can say, salvation down people's throats. And so what they're doing is, not only are they persecuting people who are, scientists and so on and so forth, but even Christians who don't have quite the right belief. They're being tortured as well. They're being persecuted. And what they're telling the people is that, look, you may be suffering right now, but this is good for your afterlife. We're saving your souls, even though right now we're basically, coming up with all sorts of fancy mechanisms of torturing you. So if you've ever read history books, they came up with all sorts of amazing devices to basically torture people. In other words, they came up with a device to say, how can we separate each bone one at a time? All right? So that was their scientific discovery. Anyway, so now, At this point, the end result is what? You now have secularism. Look, there has to be a separation between church and state. Why? Because anything to do with religion is inherently bad. That's one result. But the second result, and this is the one that we're going to come back to here, is that now the very concept of Allah is taken out of the picture. When Nietzsche said, when he said that God is dead, he didn't mean that God is dead. He meant dead in the hearts and minds of people. Because now the focus is not on the akhirah. If you speak about the akhirah, if you speak about the afterlife, if you speak about God, you're considered unsophisticated, irrational, backward, right? So now the focus is entirely on what? The human body, the soul. The human body, and how are we going to progress in terms of our material wealth, in terms of our own physical beings. Any sort of talk of the soul or the afterlife, it's taken out of the picture altogether. And so now you develop this intense, almost fanatical focus on materialism. And so what ends up happening is you have, as Allah Azza says, ba'san shadid. What do we say ba'san? What we said ba's? What do we say it was? Who remembers?
War.
It's war. But we also said that it also can refer to the after effects of war. So let's take a brief survey. What exactly is the result? What happened after this point? We'll take a look at it economically. In the United States, we'll come here now. In the United States, economically, if we go back to the 1970s, for the typical American household, American family, when you looked at their debt to income ratio. Now, do we have any business majors? I know we have one, kind of. But do we have any business majors? You got to raise your hands high because I can't. Okay, mashallah. So when we say debt to income ratio, what is that? Help us out. Who knows? Man, I haven't taken that class yet. All right. In other words, when you look at the entire debt of a family and you compare it to like how much they're earning, that brings you a ratio. So you can, if you have $100 in debt and you're making $100, the ratio is 1 to 1, right? That's what we mean by debt to income ratio. Okay. In 1952, the debt to income ratio was basically 40%, meaning you would have, basically it would be like a debt to income of 40%. So for every dollar you're earning, you have 40 cents of debt. That was 1952. You want to know what it is today? 137%. 137%. For every dollar that the American family makes, they have $1.37 in debt. Do you think they'll ever be able to pay it off? No. Now, why? And I don't want to get too deep into why, but point being is one of the reasons is the adaptation of using interest in their transactions. The entire economy, the basis of this entire economy is riba, is interest-bearing transactions. So think about it, credit cards, student loans, you name it, right? Getting a house. Every single thing in society is tied to getting debt. Hatta even like businesses. If you want to do a business, they'll always encourage you to take the route of debt as opposed to what's known as equity. Meaning, you kind of put your own funds in, get some friends and say, yo, let's start a business, put your funds in, we'll start this business. And they'll say, no, just go out and get a bank loan, man. And you can just start it with that, and that way you'll have more capitalization. And so your business will do better. But in the end, what is it signifying? Interest-bearing debt for everyone. But what's happened now? The entire society has come crumbling down. And I'm sure I don't have to expound upon what happened in 2007, right? The economic collapse. What was the reason for that? It was interest-bearing transactions. If you know how it works, so basically what they did is they took, banks at the time, they were going nuts giving people loans for houses. If you wanted to buy a house, all you had to do was have a heartbeat. And I'm not kidding about that. You could be a dog and be like, look, I want a house. Khalas. Here you go. You got it, right? You got it. You got a loan for it. And so they were giving out loans like it was going out of style. So everyone's getting a loan. But can everyone pay it off? No way. But what's even more incredible was that you had these, these kind of people who are a little creative, and they said, the banks aren't only going to give people loans, we're going to package these loans into something called asset-backed securities. So we'll take these loans, package them in something called asset-backed securities, and we'll sell them to people. Like, how you buy stocks? You can now buy asset-backed securities. And so, people all over the world started to invest in these things. You had people that were investing in them, like for instance, pension funds. Government pensions were investing in asset-backed securities, which were what? These home loans packaged up and sold to people. So now you have pension funds you have governments that are investing in it. You have universities that are investing in it. You have individuals that are investing in it. People have their retirement funds in these funds. But what happens when people can't pay it off? The entire system comes crumbling down. And so all the people that had invested in it through their pensions and through their everything, it's destroyed. Ba'san shadid, right? We said that like the first, you see that economically what happens after war, it's destruction, right? What about, let's say socially, like family relations? Back in you can say around the 1970s, the nuclear family, right, having a husband, a wife, and kids, and generally the husband goes out to work and the wife stays home, which nowadays is considered something very backward. But at that time, in the late 60s, early 70s, this was considered commonplace. And so the husband would go out to work, and because of the economy, you only needed one income. And just to make a long story short, because of the way the economy was structured, it was built on riba, that started to happen where now you had to have two people go out to work because you need to maintain a certain standard of living. When both parties are out to work, who's taking care of the kids? The third parent. You guys know what I'm talking about? The television, right? And the television, as we know, they're obviously teaching us about taqwa and iman and coming close to Allah Azza wa Jal and not being materialistic at all, right? No way. Like I have my own son, he comes up to me, he's like, yo, I want this Power Rangers so and so. I'm like, where are you learning these things, right? And it's like, it's the TV. Because the whole concept of materialism is being pumped right from a very young age. And so that's why everyone is growing up, we want to amass more and more and more. Going back to what? Going back to the very idea that the only thing that's important is this present life. You're going to focus on something, it's this present life. You want to focus on your soul? No. Don't worry about the soul. You have to worry about building yourself in this life. So it starts at a very young age. Both parents are out, children are at home, they're getting raised by the third parent. What are the results? I'll give you an example. Okay. He didn't want that to go off in the middle, then have me answer it. So what were some of the results? Okay, I'll mention some. Columbine, Virginia Tech, right? Who wants to throw in a couple more? What was that Batman movie that someone went in and just went nuts and shot up the entire theater? Right? And there's so many examples you can give. Like 20, 30 years ago, no one would ever think that would happen. Here in the United States, no one could imagine that someone would go into a school, a movie theater, a shopping mall, whatever it be, and just kill people for no reason. Right? It's just, why? Why are you doing it? To be on TV or why? And it reminds me of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He says that one of the signs of the last day is that you will find that you will have a person who will kill but not know why he's killing, and you'll have a person that's killed and not know why they're killed. It's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And we're going through those times. But you see, what are the effects, even socially? Ba'san shadid. It's a destruction, right? So now, we'll take one more example. Akhlaq, in the morals. I used to teach accounting a while back. And I asked some of the students, I said, look, when I didn't go to high school here in the States. I went to high school in Pakistan. So I asked some of the students, I said, when I was in high school in Pakistan, I remember this one chemistry professor. And at the time, I hated his guts. But after I had graduated and I came to college, I realized he taught me organic chemistry like I knew it inside out. But anyway, so I remember once when I was in class, and I had just walked in behind him, right? So if the professor walks in, you walk in right behind them. I mean, is that really technically late? Are you late? I mean, I think there's ikhtilaf, right, on that one. So I was like, okay, I'm not really late, but apparently he thought I was late, okay? So I sit down, he sits down, he says, Mr. Tasleem, stand up and put both your hands up, okay? And these classes are like 50 minutes long. So there I am, and it was Ramadan and I was fasting too. So there I am, and they didn't have air conditioning, so I'm now adding more. So there I am sitting with my two hands up, and I'm literally like, wow, I cannot believe I don't think it was late, right? So I'm standing there. What's even more incredible is he tells the guy next to me, he says, I forgot what the guy's name was, Usman or whatever it was. He goes, Usman, I want you to look at Mr. Tasleem. If his hands even come down a little bit, you stand up and you put your hands up too. Allahu Akbar. You know, I was like, are you kidding me? And eventually what happened was my hands did come down and he ended up standing up too. And he's cursing me the whole time, right? He's like, dude, seriously? I mean, you had to walk in late? And I was like, it wasn't late, you know? Anyway. So the point was, so that was my experience. And I used to hate the guy. But one thing that I realized after I had graduated, after I finished, and when I walked into like my organic chemistry, class, I think it was like second year of college, I realized I had learned so much from him. And I took so much from him that now that I think back, we had this immense level of respect for him, right? But at the time, in my own mind, I was like basically cursing the guy out or whatever. But we never had this thing of we're going to disrespect our teacher. Never. It never crossed our minds. So anyways, coming back to the class, I was telling my accounting students about this. And I said, this is where I was. And I told them the story about my chemistry professor. And they said, and a couple of them, they had gone to school, gone to high school here in certain neighborhoods in Houston. I don't know if you're familiar, like 3rd Ward, 5th Ward, whatever. If you're familiar with Houston, it's not the best of neighborhoods. Anyway, so they told me that, man, we didn't care about our instructors. When it came to our teachers, we were like, who are you? What are you? You can't tell us what to do. My mom doesn't tell me what to do. Who are you, right? No respect for the mu'allim or the mu'allama. So even like when it comes in terms of akhlaq, this is the person that's educating you, that's giving you something that you're going to take for the rest of your life and use. So you would think, all right, there should be some level of respect. But even in terms of that, there's a breakdown, right? Ba'san shadid. There's this end result of like this type of what happened, the after effects of the war. So now, did the Prophet ﷺ foresee that? We could plausibly say yes. And that's why he was baghi'a. He was looking forward and saying, what are the effects of this one kalima, which was what? That Allah Azza wa Jalla has taken a son, the Trinity. So now it ends up with what? Because of that one kalima, because of that one philosophy, that one concept, people have now gone to the other extreme. All right, we're going to go ahead and jump onto secularism, atheism, whatever it may be. So now you have the Prophet ﷺ. He's worried about that, right? Extremely worried. Baghi'a. But what's even interesting is that right after that, فَلَعَلَّكَ بَاخِعٌ نَفْسَكَ عَلَىٰ آثَارِهِمْ, that perhaps you would kill yourself over the athar, the effects of that one kalima, which we just discussed. إِلَّمْ يُؤْمِنُوا بِهَذَا الْحَدِيثِ أَسَفًا. If that they do not believe and in this message. Now the word that Allah Azza wa Jalla uses is hadith, which is speech. Okay? Not a book. The ayah start off with kitab, the word kitab, but here Allah Azza wa Jalla uses the word hadith, which means speech, to speak. Meaning what? First and foremost, that what's to come forth, the revelation that's going to continue on generation by generation is going to be not by writing per se, but by what? By speech. Until today, the Quran is conveyed primarily by speech. You have hufaz that memorize the speech. And so what this is indicative of is that the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't be alive when these effects come about. Because this is now being conveyed much later. It's a speech that's being conveyed. Right? So that you would be worried. You're going to kill yourself out of worry that people would not believe in this hadith, in this speech that's being conveyed. Asafan, in an extreme amount of sorrow. Okay, so now we ask the question, do you think the Prophet ﷺ might have understood the effect of the kalima, that one word? The Prophet ﷺ had seen things that other people had not seen. Who knows what's the very surah? Who knows what's the surah right before Surah Al-Kahf? Do we have any hufaz here, by the way? None? Okay. You do? 1, 2, any? No hufaz? Okay. Who knows? And by the way, our Sheikh here doesn't count, so obviously that. Okay. So who knows what's the surah right before Surah Al-Kahf? Who can tell me? Maryam? La. Surah Al-Isra. Okay. What is Surah Al-Isra discussing? Okay, Bani Israel is one topic. What's the title is giving it away? What's it talking about? Right, the Prophet ﷺ's night journey, right? So in one night, the Prophet ﷺ was taken from Mecca to Baytul Maqdis, from Mecca to Jerusalem, and then taken up, right, to the heavens. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, or kind of gives us a brief, kind of a brief note, you can say, about what the Prophet ﷺ saw, or how amazing it was. So for instance, in Surah Al-Najm, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مَا زَاغَ الْبَصَرُ وَمَا طَغَى, that the sight of the Prophet ﷺ did not swerve and it did not transgress its limits. And what some of the scholars mention is that when you think about the things that the Prophet ﷺ described, it was something that obviously people have not seen, but the Prophet ﷺ saw. So for example, Sidratul Muntaha, that amazing tree. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he described it, he said that it had certain colors that I can't even describe them to you. So we know our own color spectrum, right? You have like red, yellow, green, blue, whatever it is. And then you have like infrared that we're not able to see. And then, Allahu Alam, you've got other, entire spectrum of colors that we can't see. So the Prophet ﷺ is describing Sidratul Muntaha. And he says that the leaves were such and such size. They were huge. And the branches were huge, and they had these type of jugs that were like the jugs of so-and-so. And they were these huge jugs, but the colors were such that it was a dynamic tree, meaning it wasn't like just a static tree that had, a blue, green, whatever, but the colors were ever changing. And it had beautiful golden type butterflies that were flying around it. But he says that I cannot even describe the type of colors of this tree. He couldn't even describe the colors. So the Prophet ﷺ saw things that many of us, or I shouldn't say many, none of us have seen. Okay? Taban. And so that's why the Prophet ﷺ, he made a statement like, if you knew what I knew, you would laugh less and cry much. Because he was given the ability, he was taken on that night to see all of these things. Sidratul Muntaha, the people of the hellfire, how they're suffering, the people of Jannah, the prophets, and so on and so forth. So he says, if you knew what I knew, you would laugh less and cry much. Because he knows the reality of what's to happen. When each and every single one of us is going to die and go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet ﷺ is clearly aware of that. And so what my point here is that in this ayah, the fact that when Allah Azza wa Jalla is saying you may kill yourself because of the effects, meaning all of the effects that we are witnessing now in this day and age, perhaps the Prophet ﷺ understood that by that one word, that one kalima, what would be the effects? So this is something that was basically making the Prophet ﷺ break down, right? He was baqi'ah, he was almost killing himself because he understood that this is what's going to happen. Humanity now is going to stop believing in Allah and they're going to focus on this temporal world, a very extreme level of materialism. Okay, now that's that. So now here's the question. Here you are. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose you, each and every single one of you, to come under the flag of La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. You have something in your possession, which is the truth, that nobody else has. So what are you going to do about it? Are you just going to let it go and say, okay, khalas, that was a good lecture, go home, go eat, whatever. Where do we eat today?
Arpeggios.
What is it called? Arpeggios. We're going to go to Arpeggios, grab some pizza, khalas, that was good, very inspirational, khalas, we're done. Or are you going to step up and do something about it? Everyone around us is going through this ba'san shadid. And you, as a Muslim, you having the truth, you've got a different perspective. You've got a different worldview, a different paradigm. But are you going to share that worldview? Do you want goodness for the society around you? Or are you just worried about yourself? That's really the end question we want to kind of end off with. Because you see, a long time ago, how are we doing on time, by the way?
Yeah, but you have 10 minutes.
Okay. So, a long time ago, this idea of caring about people. Sometimes when we think about we're caring about people, we're giving them food, or we're helping the needy, or we're helping the poor and the impoverished, whatever it may be. So this is which is good. I mean, as Muslims, we have to do that, right? Helping the orphans, and this is why the Prophet ﷺ himself, the ulama mentioned that he himself was an orphan, so that he could understand how orphans would be and how they feel. So this is good. But let me ask you something. Caring about someone's dunya is one thing. But what about their akhirah? مَاكِثِينَ فِيهِ أَبَدًا. They're going to, in the end, when a person dies, if they die upon tawheed, then they'll be there in that event, that forever bliss. Do you want that for everyone? Or do you want to just hold on to yourself? And sometimes people say, well, look, man, we don't want to be offensive to people, right? So obviously when you talk about Islam, it may offend somebody, okay? Which it will. I mean, when the Prophet ﷺ came, you don't think he offended people? Who thinks he didn't offend anybody? Of course he did. Remember the Quraysh, right? He offended them so much that they put him, they tortured the companions and so on and so forth. So this idea that, okay, well, I don't want to offend somebody, you need to put that aside. Sometimes I give the analogy. I said, imagine now a person, he's walking and you see he's just about to fall into like an open sewage hole or something, right? Just about to fall in. And you're like, well, I don't want to offend the guy, right? Just let him fall, it's better, right? At least he won't think I'm a bad guy, And, next day when you see him, it's like, hey, how you doing? You all right? Okay, good. Right? Because, you don't want to offend the guy. But it's much better to actually save the guy, right? Yell at the guy like, hey, stop! Right? Instead of letting the person fall. And by doing nothing, meaning not calling people to Islam, by not being proactive in calling people to Islam, the people you interact with, the other students you interact with, even hatta your faculty that you interact with. Now that's really going far, I know. But even the faculty you interact with, to give them something about the truth. Because Allah Azza wa Jal chose each and every single one of you and blessed you with this deen, which is the truth in exclusion to everything else. And you shouldn't be ashamed of that. We don't have any shame in saying that, right? The Prophet ﷺ came with this message and he had no shame in saying that. And we don't have any shame in saying that. Okay. So, what I was going to say is this idea of sharing and caring about people. And I'll end with this. There was, quite some time ago, there was a guy that had this really obnoxious neighbor. And so what would happen is, this man himself was very pious. He would spend the nights praying Qiyam al-Layl. He would spend the nights praying the night prayer throughout the entire night. And his neighbor, he was really obnoxious. In other words, he would bring in all his friends and they would party like throughout the entire night, like music, bam, blasting, and it was really hard upon him. And so, and what would happen is, the guy's neighbor, after his friends would leave, after having, partied and all of that, he'd be sitting alone and he would just start singing himself, right, loud. And he would say something like, oh, the people have just left me to waste. And had the people just cared, I wouldn't have been destroyed like this, but man, the people just left me to waste. If they didn't, I would have made something out of my life. I would have been somewhere. I would have been somebody. But the people laid me to waste. They let me go. They didn't care about me. And so he would do this, and he did this for years. And his neighbor, the guy that was praying throughout the entire night, he never said anything to him, ever. I mean, he was just very patient, because if it happened to us, what would we do? We'd go right next door and be like, shut up! Right? Like, well, are you nuts? It's like 4 o'clock in the morning, right? I got to get up in the morning, whatever it is, right? Or whatever. But he was very patient. So one night, all of a sudden, the partying stopped. There's no singing, no partying. And now the man's praying Qiyam al-Layl peacefully. But the next morning, he starts to inquire, like, what happened to my neighbor? And they tell him that, look, he was arrested and the authorities took him and threw him in jail. So this man, he goes and he had some connections with, the commissioner, the police chief, whatever you want to call it. He goes to the commissioner and tells him, look, he's my neighbor. I know he's a good guy, and, basically just let him out of jail. So he's able to take him out of jail, and he's on his way back. And as they're walking, the neighbor who'd party all night, he's telling him, he's like, oh, Jazakallah khair, thank you so much. You did this, and may Allah reward you, and so on and so forth. And the neighbor that would pray all night, he said, look, I have a question for you. He said, did I leave you to waste? Right? You'd sing all night that the people have left me to waste. Am I one of those people that left you to waste? And the man said, no, indeed, you were one person who actually cared. And he took him out of jail, right? He said, you're one person that actually cared. Okay. Who was the neighbor that would pray all night? He was a man by the name of Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah. How many people have heard of him? Great scholar, right? And the man that he was with, he ended up being one of his main students and grew up to be, or continued on and became a faqih, became a scholar of Islamic jurisprudence. But what was the honest for that? The fact that Imam Abu Hanifa cared for his neighbor. He cared for another individual. And that's something, if you're going to take anything away from what we've talked about tonight, it's this idea. Asking yourself, do you care about the people around you? And if you do, then how are we not sharing this beautiful message of Islam? Now, I'm going to do a shameless plug now, and that is that tomorrow we're going to be having a dawah training. Okay? And so if you really do care, you'll come to the Dawah training tomorrow, and I think it's at Nuisi's Masjid. Nuisi's Masjid at what time?
10 a.m.
10 a.m. I thought it was 11 a.m. 10 a.m.?
10 a.m.
Okay, so I guess I'll need to get up a little earlier. All right. So 10 a.m. So the point is, it's not a simple thing about just going and telling people about Islam. Like, hey, be Muslim. Right? Obviously, that's not what we're talking about. But in terms of like, well, how do you approach someone? How are you going to start a conversation? What happens when they start throwing difficult questions at you? And they start saying like, hey man, aren't you part of that group called ISIS? What are you talking about, man? What? Right? Like, why y'all killing the people? What? Right? Or just whatever questions it is, whatever questions you get. How are you supposed to deal with situations like that? Inshallah, we're going to go over those things, how to approach people proactively, and when people come to you and ask you questions, how to deal with those questions. And what is the main focus? How exactly, what are you trying to make people leave with? That's very important. And inshallah, we're going to be talking about that tomorrow, so I'm going to stop at my shameless plug now, and I'll stop there, inshallah. Well, before I'm going to sit down. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. And jazakumullah khair, you guys. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah from my end.